It's an absolute pleasure to be out here and talk to such a distinguished group of scholars, especially people who know so much about networks, and getting to talk and learn from you guys has been a lot of fun. This is work with Kevin Cook. I'm from Chapman University, also have affiliations with MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy and Stanford Digital Economy Lab. So this is kind of the research that got me really excited about networks and thinking about the importance of social networks to people's lives. In work since this, I've kind of started focusing about how people use social networks like Facebook and get value from those, as well as kind of digital economy networks. So happy to meet and talk with you guys individually about those issues too, or talk to you about the end of the talk. But this is not about a modern social network. It's about a social network from 1495 to 1918, which is the social network of early modern European monarchs. So what do we do in this paper? We're going to construct and study a data set on the kinship networks, war, and alliance formation of early modern European monarchs. The thing we're going to show is that there's been an increase in connectivity over time, especially post-Napoleon. At the same time, we're going to estimate a causal effect of royal family ties on war. So there's going to be this identification challenge of how do you find the effect of family ties on preventing wars. We're going to show that we're going to confirm what other people have shown, which is that there's a decline in war in Europe after Napoleon. And what we're going to kind of argue is that a big part of that is this big increase in connections amongst European royalty after, in the kind of concert of Europe period. All right, so why might you think that the family relationships of rulers have anything to do with whether those countries fight wars, right? If you come to international relations from kind of a realist policy school, you think that the reason the countries fight wars is they're kind of looking at the world like a risk board or like a game board, and they see their nation as having certain national interests that maybe conflict with another nation's national interest, and then you have all these reasons why conflict might emerge. So why should any of these personal concerns of monarchs play a role? Well, there's a lot of different reasons that you might think are important. One that's particularly important is if you have a relative who's kind of in the leadership of a foreign country, that might be kind of a spy that would inform you about what's going on, maybe make wars harder or make it easier to bargain. If you've got a relative from a foreign court, maybe they're a hostage and you don't want to fight a war with that country because they'll execute that person. You might just directly have disutility from someone that you feel like you have a kinship tie to. These royal connections might lead in the long run to cultural or economic interdependence. You might have an interest in succession for your heirs, so maybe the king and the queen, king from one country, a marriage from another country, they produce an heir, and now both countries are interested in the future of that heir. And then finally, I guess this is kind of related to the idea of disutility from attacking a relative. If you look at the anthropology literature, you can find even in primitive tribes, there's kind of this ubiquitous pattern of if two tribes want to avoid fighting each other, they might have an exchange of brides. I'm going to send my bride over to your tribe, you'll send your brides over to my tribe, and now we're kind of all like family, so we don't have to fight. And I like that. I like that kind of aesthetically. We shouldn't make love, not war, right? But ultimately, whether or not any of these mechanisms are at play at the scale of European history is going to be an empirical question. That being said, we have a big identification challenge. The identification challenge is if the marriage between my family and your family is strategic, that might bias our estimates one way or the other. In particular, we think that it's going to bias our estimates towards zero, towards family connections not playing a role in preventing war. Because if you think that I'm the king of England, you guys are the king of France, if I'm worried that we're going to fight a war, I'm going to be more likely to want to try to form a connection with you. Whereas if I'm not worried we're going to fight a war, I might not worry about it. The analogy I use is for a trapeze artist. If you're a very, very reliable, safe trapeze artist, you might not need a net. Whereas if you're kind of an uncertain trapeze artist, you need a net. And therefore, if you looked at the effect of nets on our trapeze artists surviving falls, you would have a biased estimate because the really good trapeze artists don't need the net. OK. So These are the things that we think might be reasons that family connections between monarchs might prevent war, but we've got a problem in identification. Okay, so what's the period of time that we're going to be looking at? We're looking at Christian Europe from 1495 to 1918. This is a period of time where we're kind of transitioning out of feudalism and becoming modern nation states. Printing press in 1440. We have Luther's Theses in 1517, so the rise of Protestantism is right at the beginning of our sample. Power is kind of increasingly being centralized, and then you kind of have democracy at the very end of our sample. Lots of wars in terms of like the kinds of warfare we should be thinking about is kind of pike and shot armies at the beginning, and then these big Napoleonic war-style wars at the end of the period. In the middle of the period, we have the Peace of Westphalia, which establishes the modern international system, kind of codifying this idea that you really shouldn't go to war with other countries just because they decide to be Protestant and you decide to be Catholic. And then there's this well-documented kind of phenomenon from Napoleon through World War I of Europe being very peaceful, at least relative to history. It's not a lot of wars there. Some people will attribute this to a thing called the Concert of Europe, wherein all these countries, maybe organized by Austria, kind of all agree to sort of get along and have a stable balance of power for 100 years. Some people attribute this to the quote-unquote Holy Alliance between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, where they all say, we're going to think of each other as brothers, and instead of fighting each other, we're going to fight the real enemy, liberalism. Some people attribute this, when I was talking to Roman last night, maybe this is just everybody decided to become colonizers instead. We're not going to fight each other, we're going to go fight the world. But that being said, despite there's all these different theories of why there's not a lot of warfare on the continent during this 100 years, we're going to argue that the increase in family ties is playing a role here as well. Okay, so early modern Europe has got these absolute monarchies. Typically, we have male primogeniture. In some countries, the women can never inherit under Salic law. In some countries, the women are just not preferred versus others. This ends up becoming a big issue in the War of Austrian Succession, if we get into that detail. In some places, there's an elective monarchy, where we're going to choose our monarch. But the important thing for our purposes is that elective monarchies are typically choosing their leaders from a single great family. So for example, if you think about the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor was selected the same way that the American president was selected. Does anybody know? With an electoral college. Roman knew. Sorry, I jumped on you. So the Holy Roman Emperor was chosen with an electoral college of several important leaders of German states. And that being said, they usually, for basically our entire period, they just choose the next Habsburg in line. So why is this important? It's important that we're focused on monarchies that have kind of a stable family that's in charge over time, because then these family connections are going to endure over time. You might imagine if there was like a presidential system interacting with all of these guys that had a new president every 4 years, you might not get these same enduring family ties. So that's the important thing about elective monarchy, is that it's, you're usually choosing from the same great family, so these family ties are going to be maintained even after a succession. Importantly, the monarchs are choosing very, very consciously who their family members are going to marry. This is an explicitly strategic decision that a lot of mental effort is being spent on. And what's more, there are strong norms against commoner marriage. It's even more than that. There's norms against like aristocrat marriage. The royals are really only supposed to marry other royals. It's even kind of a step down to just marry a noble from your country. That's kind of frowned upon. And then the Habsburgs, the way they thought about what was going on, we have this really famous quote. And when I put it in my paper, I showed it to a historian, and they said, you shouldn't put that there because it's an anachronism. They really only started talking about this in like the 17 and 1800s, but it's talking about a period in the 13, 14, 1500s. But I love the quote so much, so I have to say it. Bella garant ali tu felix Austria nube, namque mar ali, dat tibi regna Venus, excuse me. Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry, for what Mars awards to others, Venus grants to thee. So the Habsburgs were this royal family based in Austria during our time period that was sort of really famous for thinking really strategically about these marriages, and through their marriage schemes were able to develop this vast empire crossing Europe. What I guess maybe one last idea here is these negotiated marriages weren't just my groom for your bride. Typically, not typically, but often other things were exchanged as well. There could be huge dowries, the size of annual maintenance of armies. There could be negotiations over inheritance rights. These were really well thought out, and then there would be an alliance sometimes explicitly codified in the marriage. Even at the end of the sample, people were still, so you might say, one concern you might have about this analysis is, sure, maybe this kind of Habsburg idea is really important at the beginning of our sample, but at the end of the sample, it's 1918, these are modern times. Are people really worried about this sort of feudal concern around leaders being related to each other? And at least there were people during World War I who were saying stuff like this. So we have this famous quote from Kaiser Wilhelm II right on the eve of World War II. This date may be slightly off. I apologize for it. To think George and Nicky should have played me false. If my grandmother had been alive, that's Queen Victoria of England, she would never have allowed it. So this idea of that even on the eve of World War I, the leaders were thinking about the fact that they had these close family ties and thinking about how these family ties might have been influencing their war probabilities. And then this is a really fascinating document I found from Princess Radziwill. She was like a Polish princess in exile in England writing during World War I. After the present war has come to an end, royal alliances will become once more subjects of general interest. So maybe that didn't cash out, but it's clear that even at the end of the period, people thought these were important. One kind of tradition that we're in is there's a famous Paget and Ansel paper that looks at the centrality of the Medici family in explaining the rise of the Medicis in Renaissance Florence. So this is one paper that's kind of an inspiration for us. And here's a map of the Habsburg Empire. So to talk through it a little bit, so under Charles V, Charles Quint, as you guys call him, the Habsburg Empire, is kind of started in Austria. They become involved in ruling parts of Hungary, and then later they'll conquer the rest of Hungary from the Ottomans. Charles V is the son of Joanna the Mad and Philip the Handsome, who are Joanna the Mad being the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. So the Habsburgs end up inheriting Spain as well. They conquer southern Italy. Of course, they have their American empire. This is also the age of exploration. And yeah, so the Habsburgs during this time period, right at the beginning of our time period, this is like early 1500s, end up dominating Europe. Through this system of marriage alliances, they inherit the Burgundian inheritance leads them to inherit the Netherlands. That was through a marriage and an inheritance. Bohemia ends up being integrated through a marriage. A lot of these lands become integrated through marriages and inheritances, and then discovery, I guess colonial conquest, rather than European conquest. OK, so now go ahead.
So on this idea that alliance through marriage can decrease warfare, maybe two questions. One is,
sure,
why people are fighting wars at the time? I mean, can we have an idea about strategic reason for war and to link that to strategic marriage? And the other thing is how strong these alliances were, because there are theories saying that it's because of political fragmentation actually in Europe that Europe grew. So
right.
Joël Mokier's work in particular in mind here. So how can you reconcile that with your work?
OK, so the first question, OK, give me the first question one more time, is why were there wars at all? OK, so why are there wars at all? So one way to think about Europe at this time is not as a system of countries fighting it, but as a system of great families that are all kind of rivals with each other to be more powerful, be more prestigious. Why do they fight wars? Well, presumably there's scarcity and there are bargaining frictions. And sometimes I want, there's a land that's in dispute or there's a succession that's in dispute. And we're going to fight and contest that contested land. Obviously, in the middle of our sample, we have the wars of religion. And so ideology is going to play a big factor of the Protestants don't really get along with the Catholics, although I'll argue that part of the reasons the Catholics don't get along with the Protestants is the lack of interconfessional marriage. There's 1,000,001 reasons why countries fight wars. I'm not sure. This is such a vast time period that I can't say, like, this is the reason countries fought wars. So here, okay, the second question is, there's this big literature saying kind of like the fragmentation of Europe because of the Alps, because of the Mediterranean, because of lots of the rivers and forests. Europe ends up more fragmented politically than, for example, China. How can I connect? So what's the question about that? How can I connect that to this?
So how strong the alliance were? Because basically an alliance is coordination. But the story of Mokir is that lack of coordination led to the growth of Europe.
So I guess what I would say here is that we don't really have, I use the word alliance a little bit loosely. What I'm really meaning is the lack of wars, right? So Europe is fragmented in the sense that there's all of these great families that have interests, but if they're going to fight, here's one way to think about it. There's going to be a war. I don't think that that's the right model, but imagine you had a model where there's going to be a war and then there's just uncertainty about what sides get lined up on during the war. So maybe what's happening is that there's going to be a war, but what determines what sides people line up on are these family networks. That would be one kind of mechanism that might be at play here. Another reason, and I guess I would just push back on the idea that this is a theory of tight political coordination across these different states. Rather, this is a theory of who are you not going to fight a war with. So maybe alliance is a little bit too strong. Have I answered your questions? OK. Good questions. Hard questions. OK. So where's our data coming from? Please, yeah?
Go ahead. No, I was just...
You're just signaling the question. Go ahead.
So, I mean, today we don't do marriages, right? We do like treaties.
Right.
And in a way, treaties are better because it can be like finer, right? It's not like all or nothing. It's like we agree on the military side, but we don't agree on the economic side or the cultural side, right? And so, why like treaties can be thought of as a substitute for alliances? Of course, you got to enforce them. Now, I guess my question is, why marriages instead of treaties in that time period? And, how can we think of them as substitutes? What's the...
Right. So there are treaties also, right? There are just written documents. We agree to do this. I would view them as, they're not perfect. They're complementary in the sense that in a lot of these examples, the alliance and the marriage are being negotiated at the same time, right? So they're conscious of the fact that an alliance just written down on paper might be a dead letter. And so there's kind of this conscious idea that if we tie our two families together, that's going to give some heft, some mechanism for the alliance actually being substantive. So I would think of them, the written document and the marriage, as being more complementary rather than substitutable. And whether or not it works that way today, I think recent history has suggested that international law, as written down on paper, isn't super effective without actually empathy between leaders. So I would say that modern days certainly don't anti-bear this out. OK, where does our data come from? Our genealogy is from Thomson's Royal Genealogy Collection. So this is this giant data collection that was put together on all the royal families of Europe that was already mostly digitized in the way that we could use it. So we've got this big, giant family tree of all these royal families. We're complementing this with Spuyler's Rulers and Governments of the World. So this allows us to match this giant family tree to who's ruling what country at which period in time. Then we need to know which countries are fighting wars with each other. That's primarily based off of Wright's A Study of War, who's got a great data set on historical wars. This is complemented with a bunch of other sources. This is a little bit of an older source, but it's still pretty good. But we were able to improve upon it, add some additional countries. And then we've got a lot of different covariate sources. So one of the most important covariates in predicting wars might be like, are the two countries adjacent? So for adjacency, we're using the Centennia Historical Atlas. This allows us to combine an unbalanced panel of pairs of country years. So here's our unbalanced panel of pair of country years. You can see from Limburg that we have as a sovereign European country for like 5 years during the kind of German reorganization, all the way to countries like you know and love, like Denmark, Sweden, Austria, Aragon, which there's kind of a successor state issue. So when you do country fixed effects, you have to decide which successor state's going to get the country fixed effect. Moscow evolving to Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an unbalanced panel. Later, for robustness, we'll try restricting attention to just the states that are basically in the period for almost all the sample, if you think there's some sort of selection with countries bouncing in and out of the sample. OK, so now we have to construct a network. A node is going to be any living royal, and the median year is going to have 872 royals alive. An edge is going to connect, so for our main network that we're going to analyze, a first-degree connection are siblings, a brother and sister, a parent and child, and a marriage. And we do break these with divorces. A and B are connected when there is a sequence of edges starting with A and ending with B. And then we're going to measure two different notions of how closely connected two royals are. The first notion is the shortest path, so how many edges get you from King of England to King of France. And the second is a resistance distance. So resistance distance is a measure of network closeness that uses kind of like all of the different ways that our two families might be connected. The results are pretty similar, so I'm going to focus on kind of the simpler, shortest path measure. Finally, as an additional covariate, although we don't have identifying variation on this, we can also look at how genetically related the pair of royals are. So do they share some sort of common ancestor? How many steps up do you have to go between the royals before they share a common ancestor? OK, so here's a simple example. Here's the King of England. Here's the King of France. If the King of England's daughter is married to the King of France, they would have a shortest path of 2. 1, 2. They might also be connected via a more complicated route. So maybe the King of England's grandson is married to the King of France's granddaughter. Here, the shortest path length would be 2, 1, 2. There's obviously this other path. The resistance distance would take into account both of this 2 path and this 5 path. And you get kind of a composite measure thinking of all the different ways to get through. Please.
So I'm just not entirely certain.
Please.
What's a royal?
What's a royal?
Yeah.
It's someone who is a member of a royal family. So you have to have the right last name, basically.
Okay, so think of the Al Saud in Saudi Arabia,
right? Any Saud would be counted as a royal.
Okay, but that's like a lot of people. You got the sort of third cousins. Are these guys right? You got some very small Al Saud that don't really matter. So how?
It's basically restricted to our data set. So let me show you this. Perfect.
Bastards included?
Bastards would not be included unless they're legitimized. So no bastards. So what do we have here? You can see early in our sample, we only see about between 500 and 1,000 royals at any given time. So this is probably what this means is in our genealogical data, those third cousins or those second cousins aren't being included. But by 1700, you can see we're up to 4,000, 5,000 royals being alive at a point in time. So now those second, third cousins are showing up in our data. That being said, unless those third cousins are forming a shortest, are kind of connecting over to the other royal family, the fact that we're missing them isn't a big deal because they're not on the shortest paths. And also, you might imagine those third cousin connections to my third cousin to your third cousin is such a long path that it maybe doesn't even have that big of a role. So yes, we probably are missing some third cousins down here. Please.
You mentioned genetic distance. Maybe it's not a relevant question, but wouldn't there be a trade-off if my aim is to have years, yes, to have my kids marry within this limited number of people who are royals?
Yeah, so almost all these people are marrying other royals, right? You're not supposed to marry commoners, and it's frowned upon to marry aristocrats who aren't royals. That's actually kind of one of the reasons it's kind of a good thing that you get this fractured Holy Roman Empire, because you have all of these little states where if you're the daughter of the leader of the electoral palatinate of the Rhine, you're still a royal because you're in the royal family of this sovereign, even if it's not a giant German state. But to answer your question, do you want to marry into the royals, and then do you want to marry into your own family, right? So we know the kind of the Spanish Habsburg consequences of that. If you're very emphasizing only marrying within your own royal family, then you can get the Spanish Habsburg super inbred problem.
So marrying as well can lead to inheritance conflicts, right, for the realms. I can get one example of this. I mean, it's France versus England case.
Yeah, of course.
But I'm wondering whether this is something that happened always or not.
So this 100% happens, that you get succession crises where people want different people on the throne. So one famous example is the War of Spanish Succession, where there's a Habsburg heir, and then there's also a Bourbon heir. And so there's a conflict of, the Habsburgs ended up fighting the French over that. There's the War of Austrian Succession, where there's a conflict over whether Maria Theresa can inherit the Austrian lands. And of course, Frederick the Great of Prussia, famous misogynist, says, no, ladies can't be in charge, and fights a war against Austria. So yeah, succession crises are 100% a thing. And actually, Erasmus says this is why marriage alliances actually create more war. Erasmus says that if you're basically going to be sucked into foreign conflicts because of this. So, the subtitle of this presentation is Why Erasmus is Wrong. Please, yeah.
You're talking about war, but it's wars between countries, not civil wars. Is it because it's less of an issue during the period?
Well, you can't be related to, the king is not usually related to the Civil War leader. There's usually no family relationship there.
But wouldn't you want to include them in the sample list? I don't
know. Good question. Civil wars are important during this time period, but we're focused on international conflicts. That's a fair question. Yeah.
So you don't have dukes and duchesses at all in your sample. It's just kings.
Only to the extent that they're married into the royal family. So it does happen that dukes and duchesses, they do get married into royal families. So only after they do that.
And you are not worried that you maybe underestimate some connections that you made have?
Right. So that comes back to this, right? Early in the period, maybe there are some long-distance connections we're missing, but then later in the period, I'm more confident we have universal coverage. Please.
I was wondering if you were dealing with the change in political regimes, because it's something that's probably quite a lot over the period.
Right.
And especially with France, because we went from monarchy to...
Right, you can see these gaps here in France, right? So in order to be in my data set, you need to be a sovereign Christian monarchy. So you can see there are periods of time in this data where France drops out. Here's Napoleon and the French Revolution. Here's a Republican period in 1830s, and then the post-1850, 1860 Republicanism. So yeah, so you drop in and out of our... If you're not a monarchy, you're going to drop out of our sample. That might lead you to be concerned that there's like a selection problem where you're only in our data if you're a monarchy, and maybe there's something about family connections that cause being a monarchy. in order to deal with that, we're going to do a robustness where we only look at this top group of countries that are basically in the data the entire time, and all of the results go through. Yeah?
Sorry, what it is also the case for Prussia?
Prussia, why is Prussia, this is occupied by Napoleon, so they're not independent in this year. And then after 18, and then, is it mine Prussia? Let me get my row right. No, Prussia, oh, down here, okay. Why do they drop out? They probably get combined into Germany. So I give Germany the Holy Roman Empire's fixed effect. So I say that after German unification, there's no more Prussia, but there's a Germany. I know, yeah, you might think that really Germany is more the heirs of Prussia than the heirs of Austria.
There was still a king of Prussia.
There's say it one more time. The Hohenzollerns end up ruling. So yeah, so this is like a question, right? Which is, so who should get the Germany fixed effect? Should it be Prussia or should it be the Holy Roman Empire, right? It's an ambiguous question. I guess you could think that maybe Prussia should get Germany's fixed effect instead of the Holy Roman Empire. It's not. I doubt it's going to make a giant difference to our results. Yeah.
So just to make sure I understand the construction of the data,
Yeah.
basically the monarch takes their family tree with them, right? So if there's a change of dynasties, then all the previous ties are gone,
Right.
and they're replaced by the new ties.
Right. The way to think about this is a network of rulers, not a network of countries. Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter, is Germany Prussia or is Prussia Germany, in the sense that after reunification, the sort of new ruling family from Prussia,
Right.
the ties will change.
Exactly. So yeah, you're getting the Hohenzollerns. The only reason that this matters is we're going to include a dyadic fixed effect, right? So maybe our pair of countries tends to go to war a lot no matter our dynasty. So that's the little edge case in which it matters. But the main thing is you switch from the Habsburgs to the Hohenzollerns. And so you get that network instead of the first network.
Yes, it is the same for Bavaria. In fact.
Same for Bavaria. Yep, exactly.
Bavaria.
Yep,
And
yep.
in fact, the Germany Empire is a date of birth. It was really the melting of all German states. It was after the first French-German.
The Franco-Prussian War, right?
1870.
Right here, yeah. So that's where we 1870. So that's where we have Prussia disappearing.
1870.
Yeah. So 1860 is this vertical line here. So here's 1870. Maybe?
1870.
Yeah, right here. It's a little bit hard to see, right? Yeah, yeah. So this is 1860 is this vertical line, right? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about my data. So we have 88,000 country pair years. That's our unit of analysis, a country pair year or a dyad year. Countries are at war 4% of the time. Countries start wars about 1% of years they start a war. A given pair of countries starts a war in about 1% of years. And conditional on a war existing, it's got an 80% chance of continuing into the next year. Then we've got a bunch of covariates that I can talk about. We can include these. They basically don't do anything. Yep.
Do you also count any event that could happen, like in Africa or in America during the exploration and so on, as a war? Or
so like Spain conquering the Incas isn't in our data because the Incas aren't a Christian monarchy in Europe, right?
But the English fighting with
But
them.
if the English fight the Spanish in Americas, that's in our data. That counts, right? So what we call, in America, we call the French and Indian War is the War of Austrian Succession. So that's an example that's just in the data under a couple of different names.
But then it raises the question of whether those weddings, those alliances were preventing from war, like in Europe, or also like, do you think there is kind of like difference in the objective of those weddings regarding like, okay, we are going to fight for exploration, so it's fine if we had a conflict there, but we just don't want any conflict on our land.
So Yeah, so it's a fair question. So it is definitely the case that kind of towards the end of our period, there's a lot of colonial expansion, but not a lot of inter-European warfare. At the beginning of our period, the Americas, like, nobody really cares about. They're like a backwater. And so things, again, in America, we call it the French and Indian War because the English were fighting the French and the Indians. That's just like a sideshow of the War of Austrian Succession happening in the 1740s on the continent. So to answer your question, I think that wars in the Americas at the beginning of our sample are really a sideshow, but if they did happen, they would be in our data. And then later in the period, there might have been a little bit of a substitution, which is, for whatever reason, I have a theory of why, we don't want to fight on the continent, so we're going to fight these colonial expansionists against foreign powers, not against European powers. OK, so let me show you how this network evolves over time. The main takeaway is that they get increasingly densely connected. So every node here is a capital of a country that we have in our data set in that year. So I can start advancing it forward, 1500, 1550, pretty connected. Then Protestantism starts spreading, and that's actually a big obstacle to marriages across some of these states, because as you get these Protestant states, they can't marry the Catholic electors. So what you start to see emerging is you've got like these Catholic cluster down here, and then like a Protestant cluster up here. So this is after the 30 Years' War. Here's Catholic land, here's Protestant land. And then eventually, Russia moves the capital to St. Petersburg, and then they get intertwined into the European networks too. So after Peter the Great, he says, you know what, go marry some German princesses, and we can be included in the international system. And you can see, like, by the end of this period, we're just kind of fully saturated. Everybody's connected to everybody. OK. But let's think about how does that density and connection correlate at the aggregate level with warfare. So the hollow circles here are going to report the share of dyads with those kinship ties. So as you can see, it's kind of like flat. Maybe there's a little bit of a decrease here in the early days of Protestantism, but then it just kind of increases and is very high in the kind of Concert of Europe period. So around 75% of pairs of countries having related rulers. At the same time, we've got this sort of hump in the other direction of there's some amount of war before Protestantism. Then you've got the wars of religion up here and the 30 Years' War, a bunch of wars, War of Spanish Succession, War of Austrian Succession, and then Concert of Europe, again, between Napoleon and World War I, we've got very few wars between European powers. So suggests as evidence at the aggregate level that there's some sort of inverse relationship here between rulers being connected and wars between those rulers. Please.
Do you have any way to weight these wars? Because I guess that not all of them are equivalent in terms of casualty.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll show you some results that are weighed by log of battle deaths, and that goes through. So that same result. So in the same way that these prevent wars, they prevent battle deaths from wars. OK. So maybe I'll talk about the 30 Years' War for a second. Maybe you guys are all already familiar with it, but for those of you who forget, the year is 1618, and there's a problem in Bohemia. There's a problem in Bohemia over here, which is the Bohemian king has died, and the Habsburgs want a new Habsburg royal to ascend to the throne of Bohemia, which is an elective monarchy. And if everything's going smoothly as it's supposed to, they should elect a new Habsburg ruler to be ruler of Bohemia. But Bohemia has started to get, modern-day Czech Republic, has started to get very Protestant. There's this group of Protestant burghers and nobles who are like, well, maybe we don't want a Catholic Habsburg ruler. Maybe we want somebody else. And so they end up electing this guy over here, Frederick V of the Electoral Palatinate of the Rhine. Frederick V's lands aren't very strong, but Frederick V has something important. he's intimately got family ties with all of the Protestant countries in Europe through his marriages. His father-in-law is the King of England. His grandfather-in-law is the stadtholder of the Protestant Netherlands. He's got some sort of relationship to Denmark and Prussia, which I'm blanking on right now. But so Frederick V, his lands aren't strong, but he's right at the middle of Protestant politics. And so the Bohemians said, all right, we're going to make Frederick V king. They invite him over. And now the Habsburgs say, we can't let that happen. The reason the Habsburgs can't let that happen is because Bohemia turns out to be the pivotal voter in the Electoral College. It's like in America, if we were fighting over, I don't know, Michigan, and so we got to fight over Michigan to see who's going to be president of the Holy Roman Empire, right? And so the Habsburgs say, this is bad. They send a representative over to Bohemia. Maybe you guys know this story. There's the Second Defenestration of Prague. They throw the Habsburg representative out a window. He miraculously survives. The Catholics say it's because a pair of angels bore him down. The Protestants say because he landed in a giant pile of shit. And so what happens is now with Frederick V elected as the leader of Bohemia, we're going to drag everybody into this war. So basically, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs end up fighting this coalition of Protestant states. France is kind of the oddball here. This is France under Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu. And one thing you might notice here is that France is actually connected to the Spanish Habsburgs, right? This is through a marriage. Louis XIII is married to Anne of Habsburg, who's the Spanish Infanta. And in like an interesting detail here, kind of confirming one of the mechanisms that we talk about, Anne of Austria is actually caught sending military secrets to the Spanish during the war. And Louis XIII says, when I die, do not let this lady be regent. And then when he dies, she becomes regent. So yeah. So anyway, so the 30 Years' War happens. What do I want to say here? The other thing I want to emphasize, it's a fun story, but the thing I want to emphasize is one of the mechanisms that what this suggests, what our paper suggests, is one of the mechanisms by which the wars of religion in Europe became so intense and so widespread is the lack of interconfessional marriage. These Catholic guys couldn't marry these Protestant guys, and so you ended up with these two camps that fought a war.
But wouldn't that say that it's not only the diet that is important, but the whole structure of the network, whether it's supposed to?
100% fair, 100% true. We're abstracting away from that, but that's a great, you might, if you've worked with like endogenous, like the Matt Jackson endogenous network formation and alliances, there's like lots and lots of equilibria. So very fair point. I don't have the tools in which to analyze like the entire international system and think about possible alliances, but it's a fair point. All right, so now, thank you all for letting me get to this slide before raising your hand and saying, where's the exogenous variation? All right, so here's the identification. Identifications from Erasmus. Although marriages may secure peace, they certainly cannot make it perpetual, for as soon as one of the pair dies, the bond of accord is broken. Identification strategy. OK, so if you just run an OLS relationship on how connected a pair of leaders are on whether they fight a war, it's almost nothing there. But I already argued that that's going to be biased towards 0 because you're going to want to marry families that you might fight a war with. And so what we're going to do is we're going to exploit exogenous variation caused by deaths on the shortest path that are apolitical, right? And so imagine I'm the King of England. Jan is the King of France. My son is married to his daughter. We're going to ask what happens when my son falls off a horse and now our connection has been broken. OK, so we have 262 shortest path deaths that we're going to say are not caused by politics. 71 of them are caused. So how do we find out how these people die? They're all famous. They have Wikipedia pages. So like for a vast majority of these, except for 71, we just have a Wikipedia page saying everything about them. 35 of them die of old age, 28 of them just unspecified illness, 27 of them die in childbirth, 18 from some other infection, some tuberculosis, some brain stuff, some pneumonia, long list of specific causes. There are 10 deaths that we exploit. This is kind of a result that confirms stuff that other literature. So Hoffman, who writes on early modern war, points out that unlike medieval war, where kings died all the time, in early modern war, the royals are not dying in these wars. There's exactly one battle death in our entire sample post-1500 where there is some prince who gets hit by a cannonball, but I'm blanking on who it is. There are 7 assassinations and 4 executions of monarchs in our data. We're going to throw those out because we're going to say that that's endogenous to politics. Please.
Yeah. If someone dies, there was no unwritten rule that you keep on the tie by marrying someone else in the same family?
Right, you might reform the tie, absolutely, but that's going to take time to negotiate, to actually implement. So yeah, you absolutely, you might want to reform that tie. And let me show you. Is this my next slide? Wait, let's see if it's, yeah, OK. It's in 2 slides. Wait up. All right. OK. All right, so these are our shortest path deaths that we think are not caused by politics. What we want to know is how does the chance of war change between a pair of countries after the death of a royal connecting the monarchs? That's what our theory says should affect the chance of war. And then we're going to look at the placebo of the death of just a close relative to the monarch. Maybe if just close relatives to a monarch dies, that impacts the chance of war. As well as the unexpected death. So then what this looks at, OK, so what if just somebody connected to one of the rulers dies? And then finally, in this list, you might see something like people dying of old age. That might be predictable, right? Some of these diseases, for each of these guys, we're able to go through and say, a year out, did this person look like they were going to die soon? So we can also restrict attention to unexpected deaths. And then finally, if there's an on-path death, how does that affect war between all countries, right? So again, maybe this is not a shock to our dyadic pair. Maybe this is a shock to the international system. OK. So to your point, yes, these ties are repaired after a death. So this shows, here's year 0 is the death of a pair of people who are on the shortest path connecting a pair of rulers. I haven't made this point yet, but typically we're going to take the inverse of shortest path length so that if you have so that we can handle no path easily, because an infinite path we're going to take as inverse of that. So what do you see? The pairs of countries tend to become more connected over time. And after a death shock disrupts our connection, we start to repair that connection. So absolutely, these connections are repaired. And like, eyeballing it after about maybe 5-6 years, we're kind of back to where we were in 10 years before the death. OK, so here's the first event study. We're at year 0. This is years since a shortest path death connecting a pair of rulers. Here's that event at year 0. Let me see. Hollow dots is just close family deaths. So we've got the placebo and the treatment on top of each other. So the black dots are those shortest path deaths. Here's year 0. You can see there's a little bit of an anticipatory effect. And then in the background here, this horizontal line is the 4% baseline rate of war between any pair of countries in our data. As you can see, the countries that are about to be disconnected by the shock have maybe a little bit of an elevated rate. Then starting around year -2, the chance of war between the pair of countries is going up. And then it kind of maintains up for a full 7 or 8 years after the death. Meanwhile, these white dots are just someone closely related to one of the royals dies. And you can see that has no effect on chance of war. It just kind of bobs up and down a little bit. So this is like a placebo of, is it just someone dying who's related to a ruler causing war?
Here you're just looking at the unexpected death?
This is all deaths. I'm going to show you unexpected. Yeah. So unexpected deaths is going to fix this, this anticipatory effect. You're ahead of me. Okay, so now this is the unexpected deaths. So if we throw out the people that it looks like they were going to die a year in advance, we can see that we kill the anticipatory effect, and now the chance of war jumps up in year 0 and is elevated again for about 8 years. There is a shortest path death, but now the outcome is not the pair of countries are at war. The outcome is just you're at war with anyone. So maybe there's something about shortest path deaths that negatively impact the international system, but it's not about the dyadic connection. And that seems to not be the case. This is just, I don't see much happening here. This is like another good placebo. It's really the dyadic pair that's affected by the death. It's not the international system. Yeah.
So, but if we are to think of treaties as being complementary to marriages, then the death, the disruption of a marriage would kill the kinship relationship.
Right.
It would not kill the treaty. The treaty would remain.
Right.
So why did we see that a war being triggered after the death if there is still a treaty? So if there is a true interest in being alive, then the death of a person should not disrupt it.
Well, I could flip that on its head. So if the treaty is the important thing, why do they get married when they write the treaty, right? And I'm gonna go back to my first slide. I'm gonna give you all these different reasons that might be important, right? So here's a bunch of different reasons why. So I told you a story where the marriage is like a spy in the foreign court. We saw that with Anne of Habsburg. She was literally writing letters back to Spain. Hey, France is coming at you, dudes. And right, that would be a barrier to war if you couldn't keep your secret attack secret, right? Maybe they're a hostage. Maybe they have an interest in succession. Maybe they're honorary kin, and somehow the death of the marriage destroys the honorary kin. I don't have a theory of which of these is more or less important, but I can kind of give you examples of each of these.
But in these cases, you would not have a treaty either.
No, you would have the treaty too, because there should be some formal understanding of what our relationship is. Typically, you do both. So like, let me put it this way. Even if I thought that it was hard for me to defect from a contract, because if I defected from a contract, my sneak attack would be detected, I would still want to have the contract, right? So this is like contract monitoring is one way to think of it. All right. OK, so now what you've all been here for, IV results. All right. So we're going to think of war as being caused by inverse shortest path length. D is our shortest path. This is the inverse of that. And a bunch of fixed effects and covariates. And then we're going to instrument for our shortest path length, or the inverse of shortest path length, using was there a death on our shortest path in the last 5 years. So here's the headline results. I'm going to focus on this specification here. So in a specification where this is the first stage, sorry. So yes, shortest path deaths do reduce inverse shortest path length. You saw that in the first event study figure. So the first stage works. All right, here's the main results. So in a specification where we're instrumenting in that way, and we have the dyadic pair fixed effect and a year fixed effect, we see a coefficient of negative 0.28. This is a very significant coefficient, very significant. It's a significant of negative 0.28. And then resistance distance is pretty similar, a significantly negative measure. Again, I'm going to focus on the shortest path, but again, significant negative here. When we include all of these covariates, doesn't really affect our point estimate that much. But these are all things that you might think are important. Do we share a great-grandparent? Do we have the same religion? Are our countries adjacent? Are neither of our countries landlocked, so we can attack each other with boats? And then the log of the distance between the capitals. We don't have, most people don't change their capitals all that much. So there's not we don't really have a big confidence interval on that. OK, and then over here in these final two columns, we've got, instead of just is there a war in a given year, we have war start versus war continue. And these shortest path deaths seem to have both an effect on war starts and on war continue. Although, yeah, no, although there are many fewer war continues than there are. There's not a lot of, you have to be at war for there to be a war continue. Yep.
So just one curiosity, like, so you have data on the actual borders of these countries?
Yes.
Okay, so, and these are digitized, just.
Yes, it's from the Centennia Historical Atlas series. So they have a map every single year, and yeah, I sat down there and we coded up every pair of countries in every year. It's less hard than you think because, like, you know, Russia and England are never going to be adjacent, so. Yet. All right. All right, so I gave you these coefficients. Let me interpret them for you. A typical treatment in our data. So remember, there's a background war hazard between a pair of countries of 4%. Death is going to decrease our shortest path length by 0.06 on average, which is equivalent to going from a shortest path length of 4 to a shortest path length of 5. This causes a 1.5 percentage point increase in war likelihood. So that's a typical shortest path death. To give you a sense of like what a big shortest path death would do, a marriage between the children of two rulers would have a length of 3. So my son is married to your daughter. My son, me to my son to your daughter to you. So that would be a shortest path of 3. If we go from our children being married to being completely disconnected, that would raise war frequency by 8.6 percentage points. So going from a 4% rate of wars to a 12% rate of wars. So this is like a giant effect. So, yeah, go ahead.
And in terms of the relativity of the family members, do you observe some heterogeneity in terms of the? I mean, if my sister is married comparing to my daughter, I mean, you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I see. Like maybe we don't want to treat all these edges the same. Maybe like a sibling edge is different than a parent-child edge. It's a great direction for future research. I don't have it in this paper. But yeah, you can imagine all of these so this, like, I'm going to say this at the end, but this data set is all publicly available. You can find it, download this all on IPCSR. I want more people working with this data. It took us a long, long time to put it together. Variations like that are fascinating. Variations like thinking about the entire international system are fascinating. I've talked to Matt Jackson about thinking about an endogenous marriage model. So there'd be like one of the cool things about this data set is like you also theoretically have the entire universe of people you're allowed to marry. So you could imagine even a structural model where we're directly modeling who marries who. Again, that's beyond the scope of this paper, but that would be a really exciting next direction also. OK, so now I'm going to show you a couple of robustness things. Robustness thing number 1 is, first, let's split the data to pre-1800 versus post-1800. Significant in both periods, but post-1800, the effect is a little bit attenuated. I don't know if that's just because wars are less frequent or if there's some sense in which ideology is maybe playing more of a role in this latter period. If you drop, maybe you think this is all the Habsburgs. The Habsburgs were super good at this. Everybody else not so much. If you drop the Habsburgs from the sample, the point estimate is almost unaffected. And then finally, this is to that first issue about selection, about, well, some of these countries are monarchies and then republics and then monarchies again, or they drop in and out of the sample. If you restrict attention to just the polities that are basically in the sample almost the entire period of time, again, you get a very similar point estimate. So it's not being driven by selection. Here's alternate death restrictions. So maybe you're worried that my identifying deaths aren't good. So one thing you could do is throw out all of those deaths that have an unknown cause. If you throw those out, the point estimate gets a little bit larger. Second thing is you might think, so sometimes it's a ruler who is connecting another pair of rulers who dies. So imagine like I'm the king of France, Jan is the king of England, and somehow we're connected through the king of Spain. The king of Spain is on the shortest path between us. So we never identify from, if we're interested in the effect of war of on war between England and France, we never identify off of the death of the focal ruler, because obviously there's a lot going on there. But you might imagine throwing out any deaths of rulers who are kind of on the path between the share of rulers, because maybe when rulers dies, that does something to the international system other than cutting off the shortest path length. And what you see is when you restrict attention to non-ruler deaths on the shortest path, the effect is attenuated a little bit. So it's kind of like rulers on the shortest path, they have an even more kind of gluey role in the international system than just a royal on the shortest path. You might be worried that people who are really stressed out die, and maybe you get stressed out by a stressful international situation, like I'm worried my neighbor is going to invade me. We did our best to read all of these people, all these 262 people, and figure out if they were stressed out before they died. And if you throw out anyone who's like plausibly stressed out, coefficient stays about the same. And this is what if you only look at deaths of people who are not located in one of the pair of countries. And then the effect actually gets larger, which kind of suggests that maybe the hostage or a spy story is not the only thing going on. So if there's a death of someone, again, if I'm the King of England, Jan's the King of France, there's someone connecting us who's not in England or France, and they die, that seems to have an even more important effect on the chance of war between our countries. Again, suggesting that like hostages and is not like the main thing that's happening here. OK, some other results in robustness. We can't really say anything about this blood connection because we don't have any identifying variation of it. But maybe it's plausibly exogenous in the short run if you have pair fixed effects. And then maybe there's a slight increase in war from shared grandparent. I don't know how hard to lean on that, but that's like an interesting direction for future research, is like the genetic relationships between the leaders. We can try simulated placebo deaths. So like, what if we just point at someone in this network at any point in time and say, you died, how does that affect the network? And just like, that'd be like a placebo death, and it shouldn't have any effect on the chance of war between pairs of countries. And indeed, we find no negative bias. It's not like our IV is somehow biased. If you just simulate deaths, you get a 0, a tightly estimated 0. This one's not so interesting. One thing you might want to do that's kind of like a cool direction, but we had too noisy a first stage to include in our results, is you might instrument for whether our pair of countries can have a royal marriage by whether we have the right genders of children. Right? And the gender of the children you have is plausibly exogenous. And there we get point estimates where it's like, if the gender of our children are the right genders to get married, that does decrease our chance of war. But the first stage is very noisy. So you can't really lean on that too hard. Here's 2 more alternate outcomes. So I got this question about war intensity. So what you can do is you can also take the log of the battle deaths from the war, or the log of the battle deaths per dyad year. This is log of 1+, of course. I know, I'm sorry. Log of 1+ battle deaths, log of battle deaths per dyad year. And again, you get significant results on conflict severity. And I already showed you war start, war continue. And then finally, alternate mechanisms. I showed you third party. I showed you non-ruler. OK. OK, so let me wrap it up. Erasmus admitted that the common wisdom is that dynastic marriages formed the adamantine bonds of public harmony. But he immediately questions, why is there the most fighting amongst those who are closely related? Well, we have our answer, is that you set up marriages with people that you're worried about fighting. So Erasmus, a very smart guy, did not know about endogeneity. We find that on-path death increased the chance of war between those pair of countries, but placebos don't. And maybe there's been some sort of contribution to the decline in European war. So let me show you our back of the envelope. From 1495 to 1600, the war frequency was 3%. From 1800 through inclusive of World War I, war frequency is 1.4%. And then the average shortest path length was higher, as opposed to this. Sorry, the average inverse shortest path length was larger. So if we tried to explain that, post-1800, 17.17 percentage points for a unit change in connection. So we can like multiply this difference by that number. And so we get a 0.78 percentage point decrease in war frequency if we just multiply the difference in these numbers by that number, right? And so that's about half. So it suggests that family ties were the proximate cause of about half of the decrease in war in the post-Napoleonic period. I think that's all I got for you. So I think I may have wrapped up a little bit early, but maybe that's good. Did I go really fast? Happy to take questions, happy to talk about some other network stuff that I'm working on. It's so great to be here.